Hi, everyone. So, as Sharon said, my name's Phil Lewis. I'm the CEO of Titania. So for those of you who don't know who Titania is, we're a security and compliance automation vendor. We focus specifically on vulnerability management rather than threat management. And within that, we specialize further in firewall, router, and switch configuration assessment and software vulnerability assessments. So even though I'm actually a CEO of an automation company, what I want to talk to you today about is more around the mindset that we apply to both security and to compliance. So I'm specifically wanting to talk to you about adopting a zero trust mindset to deliver consistent, sustainable security from PCI DSS compliance. What do I mean by that? So in line with what the DoD and intel agencies state, zero trust means that you've got to assume you've been breached. So that means that you can no longer just assume that you can trust everything within your network or within particular segments of your network. Rather, you've got to work to validate and verify that you can continue to trust either the people, the applications, or the devices within your network. So why am I here? And why am I specifically talking about a mindset rather than automation to start with? So as we all know, and I know from running businesses, as well as actually my consulting times and auditing days with Deloitte, people rather than technology run businesses. And people have different levels of risk tolerance and therefore risk appetite. And how people actually run those businesses and manage risk dictates how much is invested, where, and in what, to actually mitigate those risks and manage those risks. Titania has worked with hundreds of QSAs, ISAs, GRC, and SOC and NOC teams across the globe. They range from specialist pen test and sort of compliance consultancies right through to some of the largest agencies and critical national infrastructure companies along the lines of telecommunications, utilities, and financial services. So the combination of those two means that we're quite well placed to understand both the complexities of PCI DSS compliance, but also zero trust security best practice. So today, the focus will be on running through best practices in network security, reminding all of us that actually PCI DSS has been leading the way on this for some time. So we'll talk to that. I'll talk specifically to the value of adopting that zero trust mindset and communicating arguably differently to the C-suite and to your board, as well as other regulators. I think as an industry, we need to talk more effectively to risk, and we need to take our lead from the threat management companies within vulnerability management, because they've been very adept at actually talking to the board about threats, because business people generally understand the threat more than they certainly do a technical vulnerability. So there are ways and means that we, from vulnerability management, can escalate that communication away from just policy enforcement, away from compliance, to actual attack vectors and how you can reduce down your exposure to those attack vectors through effective security and compliance. So the next focus will be on the challenge. So as you can see, there's a number of stats there. We all know our industry is a significant target for attacks. We all know that the actual cost of breaches that are effective is potentially high and therefore potentially lucrative for those attackers. But we also know that it would be a lot worse if we didn't have PCI DSS already and other compliance standards. That said, there's still significant room for improvement. So the Verizon 2020 payment security report identified that approximately 43.4% of organizations, only 43.4 maintain full compliance with PCI DSS. Therefore, there is ability to improve further on this. And interestingly, particularly from our perspective, given that we're about automation, then requirement 11, according to Verizon, which is to regularly test security processes and controls, remains the worst performing of those requirements. And that has been the case for approximately 10 years. So again, as security professionals, we understand that inconsistent or unsustained compliance means that we've got an increased CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability risk exposure for critical data, applications, and networks. So that could be in the CDE, or that could be beyond. So I feel able to admit this here because we're amongst friends, but I'm very passionate about cyber hygiene and getting cyber hygiene right. It's not something I generally admit at dinner parties, but here I feel comfortable to do that. So what do I mean by that? And how does that also relate back to zero trust? So fundamentally, network segmentation, as PCI DSS mandates around the CDE, is regarded as one of the most effective mitigating controls in security strategies. So focusing in on effective network segmentation, ensuring that within that specific network segment, you're patching away your software vulnerabilities, but you recognize that misconfigurations, particularly in complex devices like routers, switches, and firewalls, they cannot simply be patched away. They need to be found, fixed, so as to close problems that have been potentially introduced by people inadvertently rather than nefariously. So that's a critical part of this, and given the role that routers, switches, and firewalls obviously play in network segmentation, it's increasingly important that we focus in on that to reduce attack surface and attack vectors. So with that in mind, security and compliance teams need continuous visibility of those misconfigurations. They need them prioritized by risk to inform remediation. And increasingly, as we move to a more evidentiary sort of compliance frameworks, those solutions need to actually provide the evidence of how you've justified and assured yourselves, and therefore the regulators and your board and your C-suite, that you are compliant. The problem is that this cannot be done alone by looking at firewalls. So 80% of network traffic is Forrester and Guardicore believe is within the perimeter. So that means you need to be looking at routers and switches as well as your firewalls. So the beauty of doing this is that segmentation doesn't just defend your network from perhaps less sophisticated attacks, arguably the ransomware, which can be equally devastating if you haven't got your cyber hygiene correct. But it also at least slows, if not prevents, more expert and targeted attacks focused on the cardholder data and your IPR. So independent research that across critical national infrastructure, so military, intel, and civilian agencies, telecoms, financial services and utilities, and the leaders within those teams, has identified that actually misconfiguration risk remains largely unidentified and unquantified by the majority of those organizations. The reason I say that is with only 4% of those, with 4% of those organizations, they're the only ones who assess all of their network devices and assess them continuously. So as we know, given the importance of these devices to our network segmentation and the fundamental that role plays in reducing and mitigating risk, this is inherently problematic. So in terms of network security best practices, again, we've talked a lot about segment your network to prevent lateral movement. You can secure the perimeter and risk assess devices inside the perimeter too. That's really, really important, as we just discussed. Effective network segmentation, according to VentureBeat and their Zero Trust article, is quantified to actually prevent or save companies about $20 million per annum on average in application downtime, in avoiding that, and effectively deflect 5 cybersecurity disasters per annum. So continuously assessing and addressing device security within the perimeter, as well as on the perimeter and the endpoint, reduces unauthorized lateral movement. It reduces your attack surface, and it reduces your threat from insiders, be they compromised people, compromised devices, or compromised applications. In fact, verifying through policy enforcement, rather than just trusting that those devices, people, and applications can be trusted, is a key tenet or a key principle behind Zero Trust. So coming back to PCI Council leading the way, then we know that we've strongly advocated segmentation in terms of the CDE, but now we're looking at ways and means that we can risk assess more devices that sit and applications on the CDE. There are recommendations to reduce the extent of sampling where automation allows. We're promoting security as a continuous process where the cadence or the frequency of the assessments is driven by risk assessments. We're also requiring, as I mentioned earlier, increased evidence of compliance with the specific requirements. And if you're following the traditional, I suppose, approach, the defined approach, then compliance with those testing procedures as well. So Zero Trust best practice, based on our discussions with some intel agencies and military agencies in the US and in the UK, tends to talk to for users and for endpoints, talks about comply to connect. So you have to prove that you are who you are, or you can prove your compliance before you're allowed to connect to the network. That's obviously more challenging with networks, routers, and switches because they provide the network. So in those instances, the discussions we've had are that you should be looking at those on a daily basis. If you can't be looking at those on a daily basis, then a monthly or quarterly or monthly snapshot combined with daily assessments of the devices that have changed in your network is the minimum that you should be really looking for from a Zero Trust perspective. This kind of proactive security is key to protecting networks from preventable attacks and delivering sustainable security and compliance assurance. So we've talked about the Zero Trust mindset. We've talked about changing mindset. So if we want to move beyond compliance being a tick box assessment, where do we start? How do we actually start that process? So Forrester believe that the DoD, and specifically the NSA, and within the DoD, their Information Assurance Agency, DISA, have developed a Zero Trust framework. And this particular diagram shows that that framework has different levels of maturity, and it defines within each of those levels what requirements you should be looking to achieve effective Zero Trust. The encouraging thing here, and this is why I believe actually the convergence of PCI DSS and Zero Trust is so important to us changing the mindset, is, as you can see highlighted in yellow, in baseline sort of assessments for Zero Trust, they highlight networks are segmented with deny all, permit by exception, and that devices are managed and compliant to IT security policies. So basic stuff, but really effective stuff, as we were saying earlier about mitigating risk and Encouragingly, KPMG, a study there has identified that 80% of commercial organizations also plan to embrace zero trust. And whilst it's very much a mindset, this is where automation and accurate and risk-focused automation combined with that mindset shift will be key in transforming our ability to deliver continuous, effective security from compliance frameworks such as PCI DSS. So we've touched on some of this before. In order to do that, as part of the mindset shift, we need to consider either investing in automation if we haven't done so already, effective automation that is, or assessing actually the automation that we've already invested in and assessing whether it is truly effective, particularly delivering continuous compliance assurance. So legacy solutions are often inaccurate. They don't scale necessarily to deliver that continuously. They're not always adequately risk-focused. So they result in potentially your teams wasting a lot of time investigating false positives. So independent research that I spoke about earlier has again identified that these organizations have identified the need to shift from ad hoc on-demand assessments to continuous assessment of configuration risks, because that's strategically important. It identifies that they validating top configurations, network configurations, is a top 3 priority for their organizations, but they do identify that the inability to effectively prioritize remediation based on risk is the biggest challenge they still face. So in summary, the key takeaways for me is that PCI continues to lead the way in compliance assurance through its continued focus on network segmentation, more formal risk assessments, focusing in on continuous security processes, and the evidentiary piece around compliance, passes as well as sort of failures. So in order to deliver on that sort of security from compliance, we need to not just report on the issues that the risks we found, we need to fix them. And we need to do it continuously, and we need to do it consistently. We've got to do the work. However, investing in sort of security alone, as I mentioned earlier, will not achieve those converging aims of zero trust and PCI DSS best practice. It ultimately requires our organizations, both vendor level and your organizations, to embrace a different mindset and to view critical security risks which do compromise confidentiality, integrity, and availability of critical data systems and services as critical business risks. And again, referencing back to trusted attack frameworks like MITRE, the NCSC attack framework is a good way of communicating that and getting those organizations to actually change their mindset. And only when organizations achieve that and they're able to maintain and able to demonstrate adequate security assurance from leading compliance standards such as PCI DSS, will they truly deliver the security that those standards were designed to deliver. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for your time today. If you have interest in actually speaking to myself or one of the team further, we're on stand 12, or as the Americans say, booth 12. My email address is here. I welcome any sort of outreach from you guys. And if you are interested in the research that I mentioned earlier, then there's a link here, or there's a link on our website. So thank you very much once again for your time, and enjoy the rest of the conference.